Hi everybody. This is Mr. Cowger. Going to go ahead and go over some of the things that we talked about this week in class, such as the cycling of matter. This is the exact same PowerPoint or slides thing that you guys have on the website, just an animated version with my voice, so you guys can see what's going on. All right. So one of the first things we talked about this week was that biology really studies everything. Remember that the prefix bio, bio, that means life. So really, we're going to be studying, small life such as cells and DNA, all the way up to like individual animals, but also how animals kind of interact with one another. That's actually what we're taking a look at this week in classes. We're starting ecology, and that's kind of like how animals and their environment interact with one another. Okay, so one of the first things we're going to talk about in key concept one, which is the cycling of matter, is something important to understand is what is a cycle. Okay, a cycle is just something that is continuously happening. It doesn't really have a start or an end, and it's just a process that's kind of ongoing, right? Kind of like you breathing. I don't know, just name something out. Like you're breathing, it doesn't really have a start and finish end or a start and finish point until you die. It's something that just kind of is ongoing, right? And then we're talking about matter. Matter is literally anything that takes up space. So here's a periodic table of elements. I don't expect you guys to have a firm understanding of all this because that's more so for next year in chemistry, but you've probably seen this before. Now remember that, again, matter is anything that takes up space. So pretty much anything you're looking at right now, including your keyboard, mouse, your phone, you as an animal, you are all made of matter. You're all made of these elements combined and rearranged to form a living thing. Sorry for that. Just had to step away from my computer. So again, remember anything that you see that's made of matter. Okay. So anything literally, I already kind of talked about this. The wall, the desk, the paper, a fan, things I'm looking at in my living room. Those are all examples of matter. Okay. So one of the things that we really need to understand is that matter, the stuff you're made of, that's not just with you, right? So it's making up right now part of a flower, part of a butterfly. But the question is, like, where is that material going to go once you die? Is it going to be stuck with you forever, or is it going to, go back and be reused? So in class, what we did is we took a look at this video right here. It goes over looking at a rabbit that is decomposing. And that over time, on day 1 and on day 2, you can see that bugs are starting to nibble on it. And then starting around day 4, you'll see like a really big kind of difference. You'll see like the fur almost look like it start moving, like right here. And that's just because the animals, as you can see the insects, they're actually eating the body of it. So the atoms and materials that are located in this rabbit, right, they're actually going to go into the flies or into the maggots and then, go into wherever they live, like, in the forest over or a mile down the road. A part of it, you guys can see that it's decomposed right here. Part of those materials actually do just go straight into the ground. That's what kind of fertilizer is, animal poop and plant animal remains. And some of it, actually even goes into the air because I'm sure if you were walking by this right now, you would probably smell it, right? Those gas molecules, the things that you smell, those would be going into the atmosphere as well. Right, so again, the main reason me showing you that, let me go back to my slide here, wherever that may be. Right, the main idea there is that atoms, right, it says, is matter created new or is it just reused over and over again? It's recycled, it's reused, right? Actually there is a law of conservation of mass that says like no new atoms can actually be created, and you'll get more of that more so in chemistry. So just know that the cycling of matter, right, no ending or start point, and matter is always going to be constantly recycled throughout the ecosystem. Things you probably kind of had an idea on already before class. So the 3 things that we kind of like to look at in biology is something called the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. right? First and foremost, don't get too bogged down with like definitions and stuff like that. You guys will have those guided notes to use on your tests and everything. We're just kind of getting the basics here, right? So I start off with a really easy diagram for the water cycle. I had asked you guys to fill out what you guys had kind of known already. We had evaporation here, right? So evaporation takes water from a surface and puts it into the atmosphere. That water, right, not stuck in the atmosphere, it can form clouds through condensation. And then if it gets too heavy, it can actually rain back down as precipitation back as somewhere else. Remember, the idea here is that water itself or any matter is always going to be constantly circulating throughout the ecosystem. Then we started looking at this slide, right? This one looks at a little bit more detailed look. So for here, I kind of exited out or kind of covered the boxes here, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I told you guys before you start freaking out and looking at this slide, we have to kind of first understand how to read it, right? So you see how there's all these blue arrows, right, coming here. Well, we know that we're looking at, the water cycle. These arrows, whether it's this one or the carbon cycle or nitrogen cycle, it just shows you where the atoms are actually going. So for here, right, we can clearly see that the atoms of molecules of water are going from your ocean or lake, whatever that body of water is, and then it is going into the sky, right? We can see that for here, our arrow is going up, so it's going from the plants up into the atmosphere, right? Our water here is going from our mountains. The snow melt is running, so it's probably going downhill, right? So the arrows right here, that represents where that water is going, okay? What we did in class is, it is a skill to kind of be able to look at a diagram and say, hey, here's what I see going on, and I think based off my options, it might be this one, right? So we took a look at, transpiration for number 1, right? I'm seeing that I got my plants here, right? My trees, and I got the arrow going up, right? Transpiration says it's just plants that release water into the atmosphere, right? So that water that the plants absorb through their roots, it's not permanently stuck there. They can actually, it's called plant sweat, actually. Transpiration is just plant sweating. So that water can actually go up into the atmosphere. Again, the idea that the molecules are not stuck in one location. For this one, evaporation, water travels from the surface into the atmosphere. There's one evaporation right here that's already labeled. So looking in between 4, 2, and 3, right, if we're looking at something that travels from the surface into the atmosphere, we're looking for an arrow that goes up, right, kind of like this one. Well, here, right, we see the water, there's a body of water here, and the arrow is traveling up, so you could probably say that one is the evaporation. Right, and again, this is just kind of getting you guys used to looking at these models and how to read them. Okay. Next, we have something called between 2 and 4. We have something called infiltration, right? So water soaks into the ground. So what you are looking at is you want to be looking at, hey, which one of these, number 4 or number 2, has to deal with water going into the ground. Like if it rains 10 inches, obviously that water is going to be some of the water is going to be absorbed, and just off the top of your head, looking at this diagram, hopefully you were able to select number 4, right? So this would be infiltration when the water actually goes into the ground, right? And again, it's not stuck there, right? It might kind of fuel a little lake down here, right? And then evaporation can take it right back up. So again, the whole idea here, I know this is biology, you're probably thinking like, why are we talking about the water cycle here? Because everything is interrelated, okay? That all matter is constantly moving around left, right, up, down, sideways, and across different ecosystems. This slide is just here for your notes of some basic definitions along with the last slide. So just already talked about that for a couple minutes. I'm not going to reference it here in this video. Again, the main idea I keep saying is that all the cycling of matter, nothing's permanently stuck with you, right? So whatever happens, I'm recording this video. It is September 14th, so this is Monday. We're having California wildfires, right, in the West Coast right now. Us right now in Illinois, we're getting like hazy sunsets from that wildfire, right? The atoms that were in the trees that are burning are not staying in California. They are traveling by wind, and they are hopping across the entire U.S. Matter and everything is constantly moving. Okay. Um, Next, just like the water cycle, is that something you have already heard of? You may or may have not have heard of something called the carbon cycle, but it's essentially the same thing. We're looking at how these elements or how these things, this stuff that life is made of, how it's constantly kind of reused throughout the ecosystem. So first of all, we have to kind of know what carbon is. Carbon is an element on the periodic table. It's represented as C. It is super common in living things. Looking at our body, actually, if you look at over here, you can see that 18% of again, this is just a kind of rough guesstimate, that 18% of you is actually made up of this carbon. But something that might be a little bit more shocking is actually you as a human being are actually mostly oxygen, right? Does that mean you're a gas? No. Not all of us. But those oxygens, again, this will make a little bit more sense when you take chemistry, but like water is H2O. You can have two hydrogens and an oxygen, both gases by themselves, but when you combine them, they make something different. They make the liquid water, right? So you're not 65% gas, but they do help make up certain molecules in your body. Okay. Taking a look at the carbon cycle, right? We're taking a look at living things, right? So we're taking a look at where do you get the energy that you need to survive. You guys are probably saying, obviously, that you eat it, right? You can't go out in the sun and just get a snack like a plant. But ultimately, what ends up happening is that you guys, my awesome scientific diagram here, right? You guys, as human beings, you guys get your energy from various food sources, right? So if I get my energy from a chicken, right? Had chicken for lunch or dinner, whatever. They get their energy from the plants, and they get their energy from the sun, right? So again, just kind of showing us how everything is interrelated. Okay. So taking a look at the carbon cycle, this looks kind of similar, but yeah, kind of different from the from the images on the water cycle. And remember that these arrows, right, these images, these represent where the motion of the carbon is going. Because again, we're looking at the carbon cycle. So for this one, so for factory and vehicle emissions, we're actually taking carbon out of the ground like fossil fuels like oil, gas, and coal. We're burning them, and then we're putting carbon back into the atmosphere here. Okay. Photosynthesis, trees, or anything green, any plants, right? They take carbon out of the atmosphere. Again, look at these arrows. They're going into the plant. They take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and they can store it in the trees themselves. They can put it into the ground. Some carbon dioxide specifically, is actually absorbed by the oceans and the waters, and that kind of stuff. All right, so taking a look right here, how many processes are putting carbon into the atmosphere? So what I want you guys to do is, again, look at the arrows and figure out how many arrows are going up into the sky, right? That's how we read these basic diagrams. So just for practice, go ahead and pause this video, and once you got your answer, go ahead and play. Okay, the correct answer should be about 3. Okay, so us as humans, like humans can actually impact these cycles, right? We're actually taking, like I mentioned earlier, taking these coal and gas reserves, burning them, and that puts carbon into the atmosphere. So carbon that was stored down here, right? We had to dig for it. We put it in our factories, or we mine it and put it in our cars and burn it, and then our carbon goes into our atmosphere, right? That's one. Over here, plant respiration. I don't care what you know what respiration is, right? The main idea right now is just being able to read our models. But plants actually give off a tiny amount of carbon dioxide, and so do animals, right? So that is 1 for the factory, 2 for the plants, and then 3 for the animal respiration. I wouldn't count photosynthesis again because that arrow is pointing down, so that would lead into the carbon going from the atmosphere into the plants. Yep. And, something I always like to do is talk about the real life connection, right? I know the carbon cycle isn't terribly wonderfully exciting. However, it is important to recognize that humans, that you even, we are kind of disrupting the natural cycle of things here on the Earth. The only thing that we have on this diagram representing human impact is our factory and car emissions. And as mentioned previously, we're taking coal and oil that is stored here down in the bottom. And when we mine it and burn it in our cars, we're taking that carbon that was once in animals and actually putting it into the air. Something I probably mentioned in class. The reason why they call them fossil fuels, guys, like oils and gas and stuff, is because they actually came from dead animals and plants. They are actually, you're putting kind of the liquefied remains of plants and animals into your car to make your car go, which is pretty nuts. Okay. Some important terminology. This one you probably already knew, right? Photosynthesis will take carbon dioxide, it will take it out of the atmosphere, as represented right here, right? So carbon will go in through photosynthesis, takes it out of the system, I guess, and stores it. However, again, going with this idea that matter is cycling, right? So it's constantly moving around. That carbon's not necessarily stuck with that animal, right? Sometimes when the animals die or they decompose, they will, go back into the ground to be reused, for another plant or an animal that might eat it, and that carbon goes into that new animal. Think about the rabbit video I showed you earlier in this video. Okay, and one of the other ways is respiration, essentially breathing, that you guys right now are giving off carbon dioxide. I'm not going to go into that too much right now because we will actually talk a little bit more about that later on in the school year. Okay. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is something called the nitrogen cycle, and this is probably the one you're least familiar with. But most of what you guys are breathing right now, before class, I probably had asked you guys this question, like, what are you breathing? You guys probably said air, right? Air is actually not a thing. Air is kind of a mixture, kind of like a concoction of different gases. But most of you guys are breathing, most of what you're breathing is not actually oxygen. Most of them is actually what's called nitrogen. Okay? Very, very important because your body does actually use nitrogen as well. So the basic things of what it is, nitrogen is just an element that is, on the periodic table. We need it for making DNA, to make our body's proteins. Plants really need it to help it grow, which is why fertilizer, actually this is a picture of the fertilizer I have downstairs in my kitchen, that fertilizers actually have a lot of nitrogen because they help plants grow. However, the really bad thing about it, I guess, is that your animals, like you and I and your cats and dogs, animals are, and most plants too, are really bad at getting nitrogen out of the air. So we have this kind of this weird thing that most of the atmosphere is made of nitrogen, but you can't use it, but you still need it, right? So there is a couple ways that actually life has evolved to use this and get around this obstacle here. Okay, just to kind of show you guys, here's an image. You have the left and the right side. Left over here is clearly larger than the right-hand side. This is what happens when you add fertilizer, which has a lot of nitrogen, to your plant growth. That's why some of your parents will probably put fertilizer on the grass or put fertilizer, in your house plants. It makes them grow really, really fast, right? Clear difference between the left side, where there's nitrogen and fertilizer, and where there's not. Okay, this is kind of going off back and looking at our model reading. Again, it is important to recognize that the arrows are telling you where that molecule is going. So take a second and pause, just practice for yourself. What process adds nitrogen into this ecosystem? So go ahead and pause real quick and take a look at that. Okay. The main one that you should see, obviously, you're adding, you're taking it out of the air, right, where most nitrogen is, and you're putting it back in. So there's a process called nitrogen fixation. That's a really fancy word for just saying making it usable. Okay, so there's a couple of bacteria that are able to suck nitrogen out of the air and make it usable for themselves, and then whatever eats the bacteria then has the nitrogen. And there's also some plants, such as soybeans and stuff I'll talk about in just a second, that add nitrogen there, right? So nitrogen fixation is extremely important. Extremely important in order to get nitrogen out of our atmosphere and into biological systems. Okay, so you guys can see here, gotta look a little bit closely, but what you'll probably notice is even around here, just outside of Aurora, where there's all those fields, you will see that the farmers, year after year, they will um, they'll rotate their crops, right? So they'll have corn one year, and the next year they do soybeans, and then the next year they do corn, and then the next year soybeans, back and forth, back and forth. There is actually a reason why this happens. And if you take a look here, when you grow corn multiple times in a row, if you look at the growth compared to the shovel here, whereas when you grow it following soybeans, you can clearly see that the left side, the corn following the soybeans, is much larger, right? And the reason why is, I'm going to go back to my diagram here, is that soybeans are actually really good at fixing nitrogen, so they're able to pull this nitrogen out of the air and put it in the ground, right? And just a reminder, plants really need nitrogen. So the reason why we see so much fertilizer having nitrogen, because it helps the plant grow. Farmers said, oh shoot, I can do this the same thing by rotating crops, right? So I plant my soybeans, which sucks in nitrogen, puts in the ground, and allows corn to kind of grow really well the next year. Again, this whole idea that nothing is kind of set in stone, that all these molecules and life processes are interconnected here. Okay, here's basic definition. I've already talked about this quite a few times in nitrogen fixation, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward. All right, so the basic idea here, and I've said it numerous times throughout this video, is that everything that you see, that you smell, is made of matter and elements, like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And that matter is constantly, consistently moving around the ecosystem. Nothing that you have right now will be permanently with you. There was a scientific study done that says that it is likely that a water molecule that you have in your body right now probably passed through a dinosaur at one point, right? Because the water's not stuck with them, right? They peed it out, or they disintegrated, and the water evaporated in the sky and then went somewhere else. And again, this idea that matter is constantly moving. You have various processes that are taking elements out of the atmosphere, and then others that are taking them, putting them into the ground. Again, you have matter moving into the atmosphere, into the ground, into living things, out of living things, all at the same time. Okay, and the big thing that we're going to focus on a lot here, up in this upcoming unit, is the fact that humans can change these cycles. That especially in terms of like the carbon cycle, right? We're digging up those fossil fuels and burning them. Well, that's causing climate change and causing a lot of problem for us. For nitrogen, sometimes if farmers add too much fertilizer to their field, right, we can end up with something that looks like this. You see all this green stuff. These are algae blooms, microscopic plants that when our farmers, let's say this was a cornfield or something right here, that when our farmers add that nitrogen there, when it rains, well, the water's not stuck there. Again, it's all moving, so it can go into our ecosystem or into our river here, and that would cause us to have, get the nitrogen in our water, which then causes lots of excess algae blooms.